Amen. We know anything about you, Tom? Did you get anything about? Okay, no yet. Boy, I know how that is. So, okay. You continue to remember Vicky and her eye in your prayers. And all right, we're in Corinthians. We didn't get very far in that last week. We had the teens, so kind of deviated, but we'll do good today. We're in the part of Corinthians where Paul is really talking about liberty, right? About what we do, how people perceive what we do. It's it's kind of a hard idea sometimes how we deal with that, the way other people see us, the things that we do, and how they take what we do, whether that harms them or hurts them in their faith. And Paul he really is a guy who is walking in two worlds, isn't he? He was a Jew, raised a Jew, born a Jew, yet now he's a Christian. I'm sure people look at him, Jews looked at him like, what are you doing? You're raised better than that. And I'm sure that Gentiles are looking at him like, we supposed to be like you or not, right? And, that's hard to do because the Jews had so many laws, so many restrictions of things they could do, things they couldn't do, and it'd be hard to change that. Paul wanted to tell them that, there's things that you can do. And he uses these sacrificed idol food, and we've talked about that, and he uses that kind of an example in here, doesn't he? This sacrifice to idol. Things that are sacrificed. Can we eat that? Can we not eat that? Well, Paul says sure, but there's always a problem with that, right? It says eating food sacrificed to idols, an idol is nothing. There is no God but one. In other words, it really doesn't matter. Even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things come and for whom we live. There is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, whom all things come and through whom we live. Not everyone knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that, they still can't get past that. Now, they know it's nothing. They know that it doesn't mean anything. They know it's not important, but it still bothers them, right? Defiles their conscience. It still is like, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe I shouldn't eat this, even though I know it's all right. Maybe I shouldn't do it. And I think in our world, there's things that people kind of hold us to a high standard sometimes, right? What we should do, what we shouldn't do, what we should drink or not drink, where we should go or not go. And people with a weak conscience, that could defile them. They could be upset by that. It could bother them to see us doing that. But I think Paul kind of goes beyond that idea. He says, don't use your freedom to become a stumbling block to the weak. In other words, don't do the things you can. If it's going to bother somebody, then maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should err to the side of not doing that. And Paul really kind of brings that to a head as we go through this idea. If anyone, and I think 10's really a hard verse. If anyone with a weak conscience sees you have this knowledge, eating in an idol's temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? It's kind of a rhetorical question. In other words, won't he think, since he sees you do something, he think it's all right to do it, even though it bothers his conscience, won't he think it's all right? You've emboldened him to do it, and by that, James says, if you think it's sin to you, then it's sin, right? James, if you think it's sin to you, then it's sin. In other words, sin is kind of three-headed, isn't it? If you think about it. On one hand, sin is this idea, and probably the real concept of sin, right, is doing something that God tells us not to do, or not doing something that God tells us to do, right? We call that sin of commission, sin of omission. So those are the two big ideas of sin. Sin isn't necessarily moral or ethical. Sin is following what God says to do both ways. Either we have to do what he says to do, or we don't do what he says not to do. Now that's kind of the basic definition of sin. But sin, if you back up from it a little bit, back off of it just a little bit, and really define what it is, what exactly is sin? Sin is what separates us from God. That's the basic definition of sin. Sin separates us from God. And that's exactly what happened with Adam and Eve, right? Eve ate of the fruit, and what did it do? It separated them from God's presence. So really the idea here is that if I do something, even though maybe it's not God saying I can't do it or God saying I can do it, even if it's not that, if I think it's something that I shouldn't be doing, if it's sin to me, in other words, then it still separates me from God. You see what I'm saying? Even though God's not saying, oh, don't do that, Rex, or God's saying, we really need to do that, Rex, if I do something that to my mind, and my conscience, if I say, oh, that's wrong, I shouldn't do that, then it puts a wall between me and God. It separates me from God because I know I need to be as sin-free as I can in order to be in God's presence. And I think you have to qualify that statement because we all know we rely on God's grace and God's mercy and God's love. But we also know that when we knowingly sin, whether it's a real sin or whether it's a perceived sin, it drives a wall between you and God, right? Closes the door. Because that's what we do when we sin. We close the door, right? We don't want people to know. So if we think we're sinning, we close that door to God because we don't want God there. We don't want God to see us in a sinful state. So to have an open relationship, right, which we want to have with God, we have to kind of have a clear conscience. Would you agree with that? Because if we don't have a clear conscience, then we wall ourselves off from God because we feel guilty, right? And when we feel guilty, just like a little kid when they do something wrong, right? Little kid does something wrong, they don't want to see you, they want to avoid you, they want right because they know that they've done something wrong. And we're kind of the same way with God. If we know we've done something wrong, we kind of want to avoid God. We kind of don't want to be close to God because we feel like we've put this division in there. So it's hard. It's a hard verse. If the weak brother is destroyed by your knowledge, and that's a really interesting idea. In other words, if I know it's okay, I know there's nothing wrong with it, but if it destroys somebody else because of it, then there's a problem here. I've done something terribly wrong, right? When you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. In other words, Paul says, anything external that I can do, I won't do that again because I'm not going to cause a brother to fall, right? And there's a lot of examples of that, a lot of examples of this, and some of it's really trivial stuff. Matter of fact, this morning when I was coming down here, I went and got a cup of coffee this morning, and I was coming down here with this cup of coffee, and I remember years ago when I did that, I thought, boy, maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe I shouldn't bring this coffee with me this morning, because there was a brother here years ago, and he said, it really bothers me when you bring coffee into our class and you set it on the communion table on Sunday morning. And so when I came in this morning and set that down, I thought, boy, maybe I shouldn't do that. I don't want to offend anybody by setting my coffee cup on this communion table. If it's that, I just won't have a cup of coffee, right? Now that seems pretty trivial, but there's a lot of things like that over the years that people have told me, right, that it bothers them or doesn't bother them. You know, I wear a suit on Sunday mornings. A lot of preachers and a lot of churches don't wear suits anymore. They give that up. Matter of fact, I've been to churches where they wear sweaters and almost shorts and sit on a stool and preach. And, and I guess maybe that's okay for some people. And people say, well, Rex, why do you wear a suit on Sunday night? Because it's, and to me, Sunday night's just as important as Sunday morning. But I always say, I know I'm not going to offend anybody by wearing a suit, right? And if I don't, then maybe I would, so I just put on a suit. Doesn't matter to me. I'm fine with it. And I've wore a uniform to go to work my entire life, and when I get on Sunday morning, I figure this is my uniform to come to work, so I just put it on, right? So things that we can do to keep from offending people is good, right? Because it doesn't matter. Stuff like that really doesn't matter. But it does matter if it bothers somebody that we love. And I think that's how we should look at it, right? We should love souls and love people. And if what I do bothers somebody that I love, then I should try to not do that thing, And I think Sam was here, he would tell you, he thinks there's knowledge in that. And I think there is too. I think as we mature and we get to be stronger Christians and we get a better relationship with each other and a better relationship with God, I think a lot of those things go away. But I still think that it's something we have to think about, especially with people who are new Christians or new to the faith, things we have to think about. And so Paul really kind of makes it a really stern statement. I just won't do it, right? If it's going to cause a problem with somebody, then I'm just not going to do it. It's not important. And I think that's really a good rule to live by. So, but on the other hand, liberty gives us things we can do too. It gives us a way to reach other people. Paul said, I become all things to all men, so by chance I might save some. Remember that? So in other words, Paul uses liberty two ways, okay? And I think that's something that we miss sometimes when we get into the Corinthian letter. If you remember right in Acts, when Paul comes back into Jerusalem, and they said, we want these Jewish brethren to accept you, right? So they said, pay for these men to finish their Nazirite vow, go into the temple, pay for these men to finish their Nazirite vow so that these Jewish Christians will accept you. So Paul does that, right? Paul circumcised Timothy, right? Because he didn't want to offend the Jews. Did he think circumcision was anything or not anything? No, he didn't. But he didn't want to offend him, right? He wanted Timothy to be effective with the Jews. And in order to be effective with the Jews, Timothy needed to be circumcised. But interestingly enough, when it came to Titus and circumcision became an issue, Paul says, I refuse to circumcise Titus because you need to understand circumcision doesn't mean anything. So even though Paul says this here, Paul also, and he uses his liberty both ways, there also comes a time where Paul says, no, we're going to understand this. We're not going to just do what you want to do, because either way I do this, I'm going to offend somebody, right? That's how it was with Titus. If I circumcise Titus, then the Gentile Christians are going to say, oh, you're saying we need to be circumcised, and you said we didn't need to be circumcised. And if I don't, if I don't circumcise him, then the Jews are like, well, you circumcised Timothy. Jews need to be circumcised. Why didn't you circumcise him? Paul says, I can't win this. Either way I do this, I'm going to offend somebody. So I'm going to do the thing I need to do. I'm going to do the right thing, and we're going to learn from this that circumcision really isn't important. So yeah, there comes a time when knowledge becomes necessary. You can't please everybody. We all know that, right? There's no way to please everybody. You just can't do it. So there comes a time where knowledge and love and acceptance and agreeing to disagree, these things have to come into play. But there's times where we can use our liberty to reach people. And I think that's important. Paul understands that. Paul says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen our Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Do we not have the right to food and drink? Do we not have the right to take believing wife along with us, as do other apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas? So now he's getting into this liberty, right? In other words, it's good. I'm not going to offend you if I don't have to, but I'm going to draw a line somewhere, right? And that line is that you're my children. I'm your apostle. What I says matters. My teaching matters. You need to believe me. Do I not have the right to live the way you live? In other words, you're holding me to a higher standard than you hold yourselves, right? You're holding me up to a higher standard than what you expect you hold yourselves to. Well, that may be true. I think sometimes that we do that to each other. But Paul here says, don't I have a right to live my life? Even though I'm an apostle, even though I saw Jesus Christ, even though I'm your teacher, don't I have a right to be a normal person? Don't I have a right to have a normal life? Don't we have a right to bring along a believing wife? Even though Paul wasn't married, he uses that example, and it gives us a little insight into Peter, that Peter brought his wife with him sometimes, which I think is kind of interesting. Don't we have a right to do that? But I think what he's driving at here is this idea of money, right? He's driving down to this idea of money. Paul was a tent maker, right? Paul made a living doing tents, making tents. That was his trade. In Judaism, every kid had to have a trade. That was part of their way they were, and that was his trade. And Paul often would make his living by making tents. But now Paul's preaching to them. He's doing a service to them. And Paul holds him, and it's interesting, he throws Barnabas. So Barnabas comes into play here. And Barnabas, if you remember right, he sold a piece of property and gave it. Barnabas was the son of encouragement. Barnabas is the one who went and got Paul. Barnabas is close to Paul, close companion of Paul. But yet here, Paul says, why is it that I and Barnabas must work? And that gives you the indication here that others who have come in there, others who are serving there, are not having to work for a living. They're being provided for by the church in Corinth. Now, Paul was provided for quite a bit by the church in Thessalonica. We know that from his letters. And they supported him even when he wasn't there, brought him money even when he wasn't there. But here Paul kind of brings up the idea that they have a financial obligation to him and Barnabas, just as well as they do to others. And yet Paul seems to think that they're shunning him on this. Now, I don't think Paul was a person who did this for money. I don't believe that's true. But I think that Paul was a guy who was telling them that they had an obligation to him just as he had an obligation to them. And this obligation was reciprocal, and that if Paul needed, and what Paul's really working at to them, and we know that, Paul's wanting them to gather up a contribution to the church in Jerusalem, right? He talks about that. We'll get there, 1 Corinthians 16. Paul's wanting them to gather up a contribution to send to the church in Jerusalem because of the famine there. That's really what 1st and 2nd Corinthians in a lot of ways boils down to, especially 2nd Corinthians, is getting that back to Jerusalem. It was really important to Paul that they do that. And Corinth was a fairly wealthy town. And so Paul here is saying that they could support him. Who serves a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of the grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk? So he's kind of using examples in an Old Testament sense. If you see that, it was not muzzling the ox, right? He's going to get into that. In Judaism, when you used your ox to tread grain under Jewish law, you couldn't muzzle him. Interestingly enough, you had to let him eat as he wanted, eat as he treaded the grain. So you couldn't muzzle him, so he couldn't eat what he was treading. And that's what Paul brings this up. He says that I don't say it from a human point of view. Doesn't the law say the same thing? And here he's bringing up the Old Testament laws written in the law of Moses. Do not muzzle an ox with his treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much we reap a material harvest? I think Paul brings this. It's interesting, isn't it? Because under Judaism, the tenth went to the temple, and the priests were supported by the temple. That's how that worked in Judaism. But now we enter this Christian age, and now you have these guys they're not supported by the temple. Paul, these guys that travel, these guys that do things, they're looking to be supported by the churches that they help. And Paul is bringing that to their attention here. Apparently they're neglecting in this, or Paul wouldn't be bringing it to their attention. And chances are, if Paul's saying this about Paul, that chances are he's really not concerned about himself. Paul says in Thessalonians, he says, I've been amply supplied, all my needs are met. But he's probably saying this about other people who are serving there and are working in that church. A lot of churches, some churches of Christ, Brent's not in here. Brent was raised in a church of Christ who we call non-institutionalized church, right? They're one of our great divisions within the churches of Christ. Non-institutionalized church of Christ, we call it, where they have no Sunday school, they don't support orphan homes, no kitchens in the churches, and no paid preachers, no paid ministers. They just preach out of the congregation. So they think it's against God's, they more or less think it's against the Bible to pay preachers, and yet here Paul says that that's something that should be done. So I really don't understand where they get that. But anyway, we have members in our brotherhood that don't believe that's right. So don't believe we should pay ministers or pay preachers. That don't believe we should have kitchens in the building. That's interesting, isn't it? And that actually comes out of the Corinthian letter about eating together wrong. You know, it's funny how we can take things and make it wrong, isn't it? You know, we have that ability to do that. But that's always been big division within the churches of Christ. Supports of orphan homes, support of missionaries. Those are all things that have divided us. Just as the church in Corinth has these divisions, we have some of these same divisions within our body. But here Paul's pretty plain, I think, about it. About that, you know, preachers can be supported, ministers can be supported, that's okay to do that. And you know, I don't know, seems pretty clear cut to me, but I don't know why we struggle with it. Is there any comments? He says if others have the right of support, and you know, he kind of in his ways talks about just singling him out. So I don't know. We did not use this right. So Paul says we didn't ask anything from you. We put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel. Don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered? In the same way the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So I don't know, it seems pretty clear cut to me that that's not a problem. I don't think you have to pay preachers or pay ministers, but I think it's fine to do it. We've had problems with paying elders here in the past. Some churches have paid elders because elders essentially are shepherds of the flock, ministers. But, you know, we reimbursed an elder here years ago when I was here, and that was a big problem. And he actually wound up leaving over that, which was very sad. So you know, I think we're able to do that and should do that if we can. You know, he says, if I preach voluntarily, I have reward. If not voluntary, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make use of my right in preaching it. Paul's really proud about that with the church in Corinth, that even though he says they should do it, he says, I'm not taking anything from you. But Paul did take from other congregations. We know that from his letters. So Paul was supported, okay, but by churches. But apparently not the church in Corinth, or that's kind of what you get out of this letter, that he didn't have to be supported by them. He was supported in other ways. He says, I make myself a slave to everyone so I may win as many as possible. And that's where we get into this, once again, this liberty that I was kind of talking about. Paul says I can use this two ways, right? Use this liberty two ways. To a Jew, I can be like a Jew, and to a Gentile, I can be like a Gentile. And Paul says, I don't have to feel guilty about that because I had the freedom to go either way, to do what I want to do. That's pretty big. That's pretty hard. That's kind of a big thought, isn't it, when you think about it? Because if he's going along with the Jewish, it's a law, and people see him doing that, then they think, well, maybe I need to do that. So it's a really hard line here, isn't it? Really fine line where we walk. if we do something to help something we maybe a faith or religion we don't agree with, then people could say, well, the Bible says, we're giving it Godspeed, right? In other words, you're showing that you support it. You're showing that you're okay with it. On the other hand, we could be like, well, I'm doing this to try to win somebody back or to teach them the right way. So, but man, that's a hard line to draw. It's just that's a hard place to be. Paul says, I've come like, to those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, so as to win those who not having the law. And Paul did. He walked two worlds. And it was a hard thing. But I think the further he got into it, the longer he was in it, the more he got away from the Judaism side of it and started, I think the more he kind of shunned that. We see that. I didn't circumcise Titus. I think we see that in Timothy's, in 2 Timothy letter, 2 Timothy. He starts to bring himself away from that. But at that particular time, he was like trying to get two groups of people into one. And in order to do that, he felt like he kind of had to walk in both those worlds to get them to come together in Christ, to get them unified. So it was a really hard balancing act that he had to walk. To the weak I become weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way so as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in games was in a strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly, because it almost seems that's what he's doing. It's like he's over here, over there, being a Jew, being a Gentile, running aimlessly, failing in the wind. It almost seems like that's what he's doing. And he wants to say, that's not what I'm doing here. I'm trying to beat my body. And 27, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified of the prize. The crown here is Stephanos. It's the victor's crown of the Greeks. That's a word here, which we don't see in Revelation. We do see it in Revelation. But mostly the crown in Revelation is the diadem or the kingly crown. This is the victor's crown. Paul says, I run it in such a way that I might get it, that I might win it. I beat my body daily. I love King James in 27, because 27 tells us the only scriptural way to eat is a buffet, right? Because in the King James it says I buffet, it says buffet, but I buffet my body daily, So, that's the only scriptural way to eat, right, is a buffet. I think it says that in the Bible here. So, I love King James there. But he says, I beat my body daily so that I won't be disqualified. Paul knows that he, of all things, has to keep himself in subjection. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. We're responsible for ourselves, to keep ourselves where we need to be. We're responsible to have a clear conscience for the things that we do. I shouldn't do things that bother my conscience. Even if maybe I'm allowed to do them, I shouldn't do that, because that affects my relationship with Christ. In the end, I have to beat myself into subjection. I have to put myself in subjection so that I can win the prize. In the end, it's my duty, my responsibility. I am my responsibility, and you are your responsibility. And I think that's what Paul's saying. It's really hard what he went through. We struggle with it. How can I be all things to all people? How can Paul be all things to all men? You can't hardly do that. You just can't. But I think you understand the sentiment of what he's trying to say. I want to save people. And if that means I need to go along and do sometimes, if I'm at liberty to do it, if I need to be all right with that, it's okay. If I'm sitting with Jews and the Jews say, we're not going to eat bacon, then Paul says, it's okay, I won't eat bacon. But if I'm over here with the Gentiles and they say, man, we sure love bacon, then Paul says, all right, I'll eat bacon with you, but I'm not going to eat bacon with them, right? Because it might offend them. You understand what I'm saying? It's a hard line. It's a hard thing to walk, because we can't please everybody all the time. But we have to satisfy our own conscience. with what we do. And I think that's an important thing in Christianity, in our walk with God, is that we do these things. Are there any comments? Oh boy. Mistakes. What was the mistake of Israel? What did they do wrong? Over and over. You know, it's always the same thing, wasn't it? Really. I mean, if you really come down to it. Idols. Didn't trust God, did they? I mean, they really didn't trust him, did they? Why did they have idols? Because they what? Didn't trust God, right? Got to have something else. I mean, ultimately, doesn't it all come back to one thing? They didn't really trust God. They didn't trust his promises. They didn't trust his ability to provide for them, his ability to deliver them. They just didn't trust him. The funny thing is that they all saw him. They knew he was there. They had the cloud. They were under the cloud. That's what Paul's saying. They're under the cloud. They all passed through the sea, right? All passed through the Red Sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. Why do you think Paul uses that terminology there? They were all baptized. Isn't it interesting? They were all baptized into what? Baptized into Moses. You see that? What does Paul mean by that? What does it mean to be baptized into Moses? They were brought out of Egypt. Yeah.
Even as they passed through the sea. So they were under his protection with God over him.
Yeah. What's the word baptized mean? Immersed. We should all know that, right? Same word as baptized is the same word here as is everywhere else in the Bible, right? Baptizo. Immersed. They were all immersed. They were all immersed into Moses in the cloud and the sea. Well, Moses brought the law, right? Moses brought the law down off Sinai. Moses was God's messenger. So essentially, what Paul's saying here is that you were immersed in God's law through Moses because you went through the same thing Moses went through. In other words, you were immersed in that. You were immersed into Moses, right? Because Moses brought the law. When we know we can't be saved by being immersed into Moses, it's interesting the terminology because they should know that too. And what Paul's saying here, he's making a distinction here. He says you weren't immersed into God, right? You weren't immersed into God. You were immersed into Moses. You were immersed into God's law, what Moses brought down. That's not going to save you, right? So even though you think you're children of God and you're Israel and you're going to be saved, Paul says no, because you weren't immersed into God. It goes right back into what he said in Acts 19, right? What baptism were you baptized, right? Well, it wasn't into Christ, it wasn't into God. You were baptized into Moses. That's not going to save you. And I really think there's a reason he kicks this in there, and sometimes we really don't see that, but it's really an interesting statement. You were baptized into Moses, right? You all ate the same food. You drank the same. And listen to what he says. He doesn't say food. What's he say? He says spiritual food. And you all had the same spiritual drink, right? For you drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Boy, that's a whole statement within itself. So you're saying Christ was in the Old Testament? Absolutely. Christ was always there, right? He says you drank from that. You drank from it, but you weren't immersed in it. You weren't immersed in that. You all partook of the same things, right? But God wasn't pleased, was he? And he scattered your bodies in the desert. In other words, you all had the opportunity. You all were there. You all had the same thing. But guess what? Most of you didn't make it because why? Because you weren't disobedient. Because you made a mistake. You didn't trust in God. So you all had it. It was all there. But not all of you made it. You were baptized into Moses. You weren't baptized into God. You drank the same spiritual food, the same spiritual drink, but yet not all of you. You see, that's a really interesting thing in Judaism, because in Jewish thought, it's like, okay, I'm a Jew. I'm born a Jew. That's my lineage. I'm a child of God because I'm born a Jew. And because I'm born a Jew, if I just do this law, then it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right. But, they couldn't quite do that, could they? They couldn't quite make that happen. So guess what? They set their hearts on evil things. They set their hearts on idols. They put their hearts on their own ability, not God's ability. There's so many lessons in that. Why didn't they cross over and drive out the nations before them? Because they didn't look for God's ability. They looked at their own ability. They crossed over. They said, we can't whip these guys. We're like grasshoppers on their side. There's no way we can win. No way we can do it. No way we can. We, I, we. Them personal pronouns. Man, you got to watch them when you're a Christian. I'm so bad about that myself. I can do this. I can handle this. I can fix this. I say that stuff all the time, right? We should, as Christians, that's not who we're supposed to be. We're a family. We're a community. It's not what I can do. It's what I can do through God. It's what we can do together, what we can do with our partnership with God. Here, Paul says they didn't do that, right? They set their hearts on evil things. They were idolaters. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry, it says. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them does. In one day, 23,000 of them died, Numbers 25. We should not, I put those in there so you can look that up if you wanted to. We should not test the Lord as some of them did, were killed by stakes, Numbers 21:5. Do not grumble as some of them did, were killed by a destroying angel, Numbers 16:49. God over and over throughout the Old Testament destroyed people that didn't obey him. So why is it any different now? It's not. It's not any different now, right? God's going to destroy those who don't obey him. They didn't obey him every time, over and over in the Old Testament. Idolatry, sexual immorality, killed by snakes. That was an interesting one, wasn't it? They were killed by the snakes, and God says, raise the snake up. Isn't that a fascinating story in the Old Testament? Every time that things happen in the Old Testament, it's like God sent a cure. But I think it's interesting in the snake story in Numbers 21. I always thought it was interesting that God put the cure on the people and not on him. Did you ever notice that? God said, I'm going to make the snake, put it on a staff, raise it up. But then what did he say to him? You ought to look at it, don't you? If you look at it, you'll be okay. I always thought that was really fascinating. God didn't say, well, I'm just going to do away with it. God says, you're going to have faith that if you look at what I sent to save you, when you think about that with me for just a minute, because I'm out of time now. Now I get onto this thing that I think is really cool. But when you think about it, if you read John says, Jesus said in John's gospel, what did he say? He says, if I'm lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. Remember that? And every time I read that and I think about the snake story in here, I really think about that idea. If I'm lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. But just like that snake in Numbers, you had to look to the snake to be saved. And just like Jesus, even though we lifted him up on a cross, you've got to look to Christ. You've got to look to the cross to be saved. God still put it on us, didn't he? And I think that's really a fascinating thought. I always think that's fascinating, the parallel, the analogy between the snake lifted up in the wilderness and Jesus being lifted up on Mount Calvary, that just like that, we have to look to him to live. And anyway, I'll leave you with that this morning. So thanks for your time.